All right, well, thank you so much. So thanks for the introduction and for inviting me here today. So I have been told I have 45 minutes to talk, so I'm just going to blow through a lot of slides here as quickly as I can. So as mentioned, I do have two main areas of research. So one is child maltreatment, and the other one is problem gambling. And I'm only going to be talking about the child maltreatment today. I would say that approximately 80 to even 90% of the work I do is actually in child maltreatment, and over time it seems to be more and more in child maltreatment. But I do still dabble in the area of problem gambling, but I won't talk about that today. So the objectives for today, I'm going to be talking about not just my research, but also how my research fits with child maltreatment in society and the current state of knowledge. It's a type of research that if you don't understand the culture and the society and the societal norms from which you're studying, then it's kind of hard to understand the research and also to move from knowledge to prevention. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about societal norms, experiences, opinions, and the culture that actually tolerates violence against children, and then move from there to talk a little bit about the research that I've done in the past. Research objective 2 is really related to the work that I'm currently doing now and the work that I'm planning on doing in the next 5 years and beyond. And then John actually asked me to add number 3 to the list, so advice for creating a successful research group. So he wanted me to talk about my research group, how we function, and the things that we attribute to our success. So first of all, when I say child maltreatment, what exactly am I talking about? So child maltreatment includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, exposure to intimate partner violence, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and physical punishment. So physical punishment is spanking, corporal punishment, slapping, smacking, different words to describe it. So when we look at the screen and we see these types of treatment towards children, initially, I think that the reaction is, yeah, these things are all really awful, and of course we shouldn't allow any of these things to happen to our children. But the reality is we do tolerate violence towards children in Canada and also, of course, worldwide. And the reason for that is there's a lot of gray zones that exist between acceptable and unacceptable treatment towards children. So as I said, it's really important to understand those societal norms and understand people's experiences and opinions and how that creates a culture that actually tolerates violence towards children. So before I talk about my research, I actually want to give 2 examples, or 3 examples actually, of how we tolerate violence towards children. So the first one is an example for physical abuse towards children. So I have a continuum here of violence. So you see at one end we have no physical force, and another end severe physical abuse. And on this continuum I've put physical acts towards children. So spanking, slapping, shoving at one end, and then children slowly burning at the other end. So what I want you to do is just sort of imagine where you would draw a line between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable behavior to children. So where would you put that line where we would say, no, this is abuse versus this is not abuse? And if we were to project those lines up from all of you up onto the screen, it's quite likely that there wouldn't just be one line in one spot, and that the line may be in different places. And that depends on your own experience, your own opinions, and perhaps the culture and society that you belong to. So some people might put it at that end and say any physical force against a child is abuse, we tolerate nothing, and therefore all of these things would be considered abuse. Other people say, well, spanking's okay, it's permitted by law in Canada, so we can spank our kids, that's not abuse, but everything else is. Other people may say, well, you know, these other things, they're just minor, so that's okay, and it's just more severe. So the line may be in different places depending on your experience. So we do tolerate some violence towards children. And we don't really have a lot of really good data on the prevalence of many different types of violence towards children. But this is one publication that we published in CMAJ in 2014 using nationally representative data for Canada. So I'll talk a little bit about the study in a few minutes. But what we found was that 23% of the general population as adults retrospectively reported that they had been slapped on the face, head, or ears, hit or spanked with something hard, and almost 11% said that they had been pushed, grabbed, shoved, or had something thrown at them. can see that does occur in Canada. And this is another study that we did in 2014, published in Child Abuse and Neglect. This is American data, and it's looking at harsh physical punishment. So that's not looking at just customary spanking, but it's looking at pushing, grabbing, shoving, hitting, so a little bit more harsh. And what you see is we have cohorts here. So at that end, we have 60 to 69 years old, and at this end, we have 20 to 29 years old. We have males, females in total. And you can see that there is a slight downward trend, and these trends are statistically significant. So we do see, as with the more younger cohorts, there's less physical punishment being reported. So we are seeing this sort of shift right now, where it seems that there's less tolerance towards physical punishment and hitting and spanking children, and that's a really good thing. But it's definitely not something where there's no tolerance or there's no discussion as whether or not we should spank our children. So it's kind of it's a really good time where I feel like things are changing, but we still tolerate a lot of physical force against children. We can also look at the example of emotional maltreatment as well. So we can do the same continuum, and we can put emotional acts towards children, so emotional types of abuse. And again, you can look at this and say, okay, where would you put the line of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable for treating children? You might say all of it's unacceptable, or you might have some tolerance for some of these things and move the line up. So in the past, we would think of, a child would get in trouble at school and they'd have to write lines on the board, or they'd have to wear the dunce cap. So these kind of sort of more older, old traditional or old-fashioned types of child maltreatment would not likely be tolerated today. But there's definitely modern-day types of emotional abuse that you'll see quite commonly today. So here's one example where a child does something wrong, and it's public shaming them. They have to hold a sign on the street corner and be publicly shamed. And the social media is actually has so many of these types of public shaming as well. So these are really, really little kids, like infants, where they've done things that are actually just normal developmental things, and they're being asked to hold signs and have their picture taken, and then their parents put that up on their Facebook page to shame them. And obviously these children don't understand what the sign says, don't understand what Facebook is, so what are they actually learning from these sorts of things? But these are all, this type of thing is still sort of the modern day shaming and emotional abuse. So we know that there's many research articles written about the harms of both public and private shaming. There's social media pages that exist that are asking parents, don't do this. And many people still support public shaming, and they actually think that this is a really good way to teach children a lesson. So if you publicly shame your kid by taking these in public on the street corner or on social media, then your child will learn. So there's lots of people that still think that this is socially acceptable. And the last example is the case of Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson. How many know about the media attention in 2014? So a couple of you? Okay, so I'll explain very briefly. This happened in 2014, and this was a very public media frenzy around the violence, the family violence that occurred for these two individuals. So these are the similarities between what was in the media. We have Ray Rice, so these are both NFL superstars. The Ray Rice case was he actually punched his fiancée unconscious in an elevator, and it was caught on a surveillance camera. So this was released, and everyone could watch this video of him punching out his fiancée. And for Adrian Peterson, he took a small branch from a tree, and he whipped his child from head to toe, and leaving injuries all over his body. And there was photographs of this 4-year-old boy with injuries covering his body. So we had visual evidence, one video, one photographs, that these treatments have occurred. They're both NFL superstars. They both created a dialogue. One created an international dialogue about the public health problem of violence against children, the other one about spanking and child abuse. And also, both of these incidents, which again, both occurred in 2014, they raised questions about should the NFL have policies to deal with things like domestic violence and violence against children. So a lot of similarities between these two cases. But what struck me that was really different between these two cases was that for the Ray Rice case, the response in the media was that there should be no tolerance for violence against women, and how can we prevent violence against women? So that was the dialogue. How do we do this? How do we prevent this from happening? That was not the dialogue for child abuse. Instead of saying the same thing, there should be no tolerance for children, how do we prevent children from being abused? The discussion and the debate was, how much violence is acceptable? Isn't this okay? It's culturally acceptable. This is a cultural thing. People in certain communities, that's our tradition, is to hit our children, and shouldn't that be our right to do that? And so the dialogue between these two cases were very different. So I've spent a little bit of time talking about, not really my research, but what's really important is I didn't really understand how my research and the connection between society and norms came to play until I was really knee-deep into my career. Because I would do this work and I would get this backlash of people saying, well, you know what, I can hit my kid, you shouldn't tell me not to hit my child. And when you're studying child abuse and you want to try and prevent it, you have to sort of, it's not just the science won't just stand on its own, but you have to then say, okay, so now we have the science, but we have to change behavior. And you can't change behavior with just the science, you have to change behavior with understanding all of these things like social norms, experiences, opinions, and how do we get people to actually change their behavior. So these two things, the science and the society, are so intertwined, and we really need to understand both of them together. So that's sort of the environment in which these things happen. So our research, we looked at, over the past about 10 years, we've looked at things like what's the prevalence of child maltreatment in Canada, and we've also looked at what's the relationship between child maltreatment and mental health outcomes. So this has been, just sort of a sampling of some of the work we've done over the last 10 years. So this is the CMAJ paper. So it was published in 2014, and it's the first nationally representative study using Canadian data that looked at the prevalence of child abuse in Canada. It also looked at the relationship between child abuse and mental health disorders. But when this paper came out, nobody cared about that. They just were really focused on the prevalence of child abuse, and that's what they were interested in, and that's sort of what the dialogue was focused on. So this was the first study that we could use representative data, and we found that 32% of the adult population in Canada had retrospectively reported experiencing physical abuse, sexual abuse, and exposure to intimate partner violence. And if we look at the types of abuse individually, we had 26%, 10%, and almost 8% exposure to intimate partner violence. And I'll talk a little bit about the mental health disorders as well as we move forward. So that was one of those things, but we still don't know a lot about the prevalence of other types of abuse in Canada, and we have lots of pockets of information from non-representative data sources, but we don't have a lot at the national level. So relative to other countries, we're actually quite far behind in understanding how child abuse occurs in Canada. So we also wanted to look at how child abuse was related to mental health. So we've done two studies that looked at health-related quality of life. And we found that all of these types of abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and a number of types of abuse, like a dose-response relationship, was associated with a decreased mental health-related quality of life. And then we wanted to look at child maltreatment with mental disorders. So we've done a number of studies from 2006 up until 2014 looking at the relationship. So we've looked at all of the different types of abuse. A lot of this comes from American data until most recently in 2014 when we had representative Canadian data. So a lot of this comes from US data. But we found that all types of child abuse were associated with many different mental disorders. We have anxiety disorders, mood disorders, substance use disorders, behavioral problems, eating disorders, gambling, personality, and also suicidal ideation and attempts. This is from the CMAJ paper, so just to give you a little bit of data, and I chose to use this one because it's quite recent and it's also Canadian data. So these are odds ratios. and just representing the categories of any abuse, yes or no. So we also looked at all of the individual types of abuse as well. So you can see the darker blue bar is the odds ratios. So the adjusted odds ratios, approximately 3 and higher, almost 4 in some cases, associated with the different types of disorders. So having experienced abuse increased the odds of depression, bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, alcohol abuse or dependence, and drug abuse or dependence. It also increased the likelihood of OCD, panic, PTSD, phobias, attention deficit disorders, eating disorders, and learning disability. So every outcome we looked at was statistically significant in adjusted models. And also suicide ideation and attempts was quite high, 4 and 6 odds ratios for ideation and attempts. We've also looked at population attributable fractions with regard to child abuse and psychiatric disorders and suicide. So what we wanted to try and do is, it's kind of more of a theoretical estimation about if you could, theoretically, if you could eliminate the child abuse from occurring, how much would you predict that the prevalence would reduce for outcomes such as mental disorders and suicidal ideation and attempts? So we did this in the American Journal of Public Health in 2008, and we did it separately for men and women. So if we could eliminate child maltreatment, the models indicated that about 22 to 32% of mental disorders would be reduced at the national level in the United States without the experience of child maltreatment. You would see a reduction of about 16% of suicidal ideation, and then the highest reduction, about 50% of suicide attempts, would be reduced. And for men, you can see similar reductions. So of course that's an important public health paper, but the challenge is how can we actually really eliminate child abuse from occurring? So that's really the important step that we still struggle with. There's been a lot of work in mental health, and there's been less work in how violence against children is related to physical health. And I find that when I do research in physical health, there's still a lot of resistance where, I can guarantee you every time I submit a paper, I'm going to get at least one review that says, this is ridiculous. Why would child abuse have any impact on physical health conditions? It doesn't, it can't. I just won't accept it. And immediately, you have no review, just reject the paper. And sometimes, depending on the other reviews and the editor, it depends on where that goes. But so some people won't even entertain the idea that it's an indirect relationship, or that there's an interaction effect happening there, or any other pathway that may be direct or indirect. They're not willing to even talk about it. But we find that there is a big relationship between child maltreatment and many different physical health outcomes. So we've looked again at health-related quality of life, and just people's, just a simple measure asking to rate their general physical health. And so child maltreatment increases the likelihood of reduced health-related quality of life, and increases the likelihood that you'll rate your general health as poor or fair. And we've done similar models where we looked at many different types of child maltreatment and many different physical health outcomes. So we published this in Pediatrics in 2013 using American data, and then in Health Reports, which is a Statistics Canada publication that is coming out in a couple of weeks, using Canadian data. So with different types of data, we find that there is a significant relationship between child maltreatment and all of these physical health conditions. So in both of these publications, we really do talk about the mechanisms. Why would violence be related to physical health, and what's the pathways? We do spend a lot of time discussing that, because there's a lot of people out there that still think that there's no way violence could have an impact on your health. And we've also done a lot of work in the area of physical punishment. So we've looked at harsh physical punishment, which is pushing, grabbing, shoving, hitting, and slapping. And we've looked at how those things are related to mental and physical health outcomes. So we found that in the literature, there's a lot of academics that think that spanking's okay, and as long as you are a loving parent, you can hit your kid, because if you hit your kid, but then hug your kid later, then any ill effects from the spanking is gone because you hugged them. And that's a theoretical perspective or opinion that's out there in the literature. So that's one thing. And there's another, people that are critics of, the anti-spanking will say, well, you know what, some kids, a lot of kids perhaps who are spanked may also experience more severe physical abuse. So unless you take that into effect, there's actually this confounding effect that's happening. So it's really not spanking, but it's the abuse that's not being accounted for in the studies that are driving the relationship between spanking and abuse. So with those two arguments out there to say, no, it's not spanking, your research is bad, spanking's fine, we tried to address those as best we could using data. So in the 2006 paper, we had measures of parental warmth. And so we had actually a lot of measures of parenting, quality of relationships, both with the mother and the father. And we had measures of harsh physical punishment, so pushing, grabbing, shoving, hitting, slapping, not just the customary spanking, and all different types of child abuse. So we had emotional abuse, we had sexual abuse, more severe physical abuse, etc. And so what we did was we looked at people that only said yes to the physical punishment, and if they said yes to any of the other types of abuse, then they were separated out. So we had a no abuse or physical punishment category, physical punishment only, and then physical punishment with or with other types of child maltreatment. So we looked at that, and these are what we found. So these are the odds ratios. We looked at for major depression, any anxiety, alcohol abuse or dependence, and externalizing problems. So what you can see is in the middle category, with the exception of anxiety disorders, physical punishment only. So these kids who were only experienced physical punishment and not all these 5 other types of abuse still had increased likelihood of having several mental disorders. And this was after adjusting for sociodemographic variables and the quality of relationship. So it was the first study that said, okay, that's an opinion that as long as you hug your kid after you hit them, they'll be okay. So that's someone's opinion, but this is data suggesting that maybe that's not the case. And then if you look, the child abuse category, the odds ratios are larger, and in most cases we're statistically larger. So it's showing that if we spank our children or we use harsh physical punishment on our children, it does increase the likelihood that many of these bad outcomes may occur, but the strength of the relationship isn't as strong as if this child also experienced more severe abuse. So it's kind of what you would expect. It's kind of that dose-response relationship that you would expect, and that's what we saw. We also looked at, I don't know if I have it, yes. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you go back?
I don't know how to go back. Can I go back?
Sorry. Why do you think there's no difference with any anxiety disorder and pretty much a stronger difference in child abuse?
Why there's no difference there?
Because you're saying most of them get worse,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I don't.
Do you have an explanation?
Yeah.
Because these are large groups and.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe what I should go back and look at what that odds ratio really, instead of just putting non-significant, go back and look what it was. Perhaps it was, you can see depression is just hanging in there.
Yeah.
So maybe it was just one of those effects where it was just hanging in there. But I don't really have an explanation why it wasn't. And then you can see the anxiety is is quite high, one of the higher ones for child abuse. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a response. It's a good question. It might be one of those things where it was just barely not significant. So it's probably one of those things where to go back and actually put the actual odds ratio in and not just look at that. But we also then looked at, so this is with American data, published in Pediatrics in 2012, and we did the same thing where we wanted to address that problem that people were saying, oh, it's a confounding effect. Because when you ask about physical punishment, but you're not asking about other types of abuse, so it's not a clean relationship. So we did that here as well. We looked at no abuse or physical punishment only, and then more severe types of abuse. And we looked at a large number of, I have it here. We looked at a large number of disorders. So we looked at several mood disorders, several anxiety disorders, alcohol and drug, and we also looked at all the personality disorders, including suicide ideation and attempts. So it's nationally representative data from the United States. We did separate out to make sure that it was these things in the absence of other severe child abuse. And we also adjusted for other household dysfunction. So if they experienced divorce, if the parents had alcohol or mental disorders, if the parents had been incarcerated, these types of things. So we tried to adjust for some household dysfunction as well. And we found across the board that physical punishment alone was associated with many of these mental disorders as well. So we tried to address the two main criticisms in the literature with these three studies, and consistently with Canadian data and with American data, we were able to find that. So in this pediatrics paper, we found we concluded that physical punishment should not be used in children of any age. We couched that in not just based on this study alone, but these data and how these data fit with the whole body of literature. We concluded that using physical punishment increases the likelihood that bad things may happen to these children, and we shouldn't assume this risk. And so this paper was one of the papers that had a really big backlash in the media. There are a lot of people didn't like that suggestion at all. So this was on, Dr. Drew talked about it, CNN, Fox, all the main news channels in the States, partly because it was American data, and also in Canada. So there was a really big discussion here about whether or not we should tolerate violence towards children or not. So it's really interesting because there's still, I'm prepared for it now, but when it first started happening, when you're suggesting that you don't use violence towards children, sometimes people get really upset about that and almost are a little bit aggressive and passively violent towards you. So I've sort of learned how to deal with that, but it's been a sort of experience, yeah.
So to me, the messaging here is part of the problem, because you mentioned dose response. And I think the man on the street or the lady on the street, when you say physical punishment, right? If my kids are fighting and I grab one and pull them away, can I just grab by your definition or not?
Yeah.
And because that, to me, that's different than grabbing and throwing in your room.
Yeah.
And so the dose response that you said sort of struck a chord with me, that where it's like alcohol is good or bad.
So,
it's not a binary
right.
thing. 2 drinks is okay, 20 is not.
So we're very careful of the language. Now here we're using physical punishment because it's not just spanking. So that's why we use the word physical punishment. And you're right, it does include those things. And in the details, these are things that don't just happen once, but these are things, and so these are things that are happening. The exact definitions of them are meant to be things that. So if it happened like half a dozen times in childhood, throughout your whole childhood, you're not in the yes group. These are definitions where it's happening, where we can sort of say this is a consistent thing that this child is experiencing, because we know kids are resilient, right? If they get spanked really hard, but it happened twice in 18 years, they're probably going to be fine. There's probably going to be no harm.
That's probably where your backlash comes from, because people aren't understanding.
That's true. It's true. But I mean, even when people also, when things are in the media, you get little sort of snippets of information, and nobody goes and reads the stuff. So we find the dose-response relation. It doesn't mean that it starts with 0. Even with the most mild level, we're still seeing an effect, but the effect just gets stronger as this child experiences more violence. The reason why we say it should not be used on children of any age is actually we do use the analogy of pregnant women and drinking. The recommendation is pregnant women should drink no alcohol. Now, what if they drank 1 drink while they're pregnant? It's probably fine. What if they drank 1 drink every month? Well, we don't know. We don't know where that line is. We don't know if it's different for each woman. What are all the factors at play? So the recommendation is no violence, because we know we can't comfortably say a certain amount is okay. So that's the thinking behind our recommendations as well.
But is any spanking? I mean, I'm still not. I agree that any spanking should not be done, because we tolerate a slap on the face for a woman or a partner in a relationship or not. And the double standard is like, well,
Yeah, so
So I personally, maybe I'm too far against any form of.
yeah, no, you can't be too far that way.
Okay.
So I, you know, if you haven't found out my bias is that, no.
Oh, do tell us, please.
So I suggest nothing. But the thing is, slapping a kid in the head is actually not permissible by law. You can hit them from here to here.
Really?
Yeah, if you hit them not in the head. So the law says that it has to be corrective. You can't do it when you're angry. So who hits their child when they're not angry, I don't know. But it has to be corrective. So not for punishment, but to correct behavior. So again, it's muddy. You can't hit them in the head. It have to be between the ages of 2 and 12. And they cannot have a learning disability. And you cannot injure them.
Like hitting, bruising, you know?
That's not allowed. So I guess the red mark, as long as it doesn't bruise. So it's a gray zone, and it's really unclear. And that's the law trying to be clarified, and that was in 2004. So there are some rules around it, but the problem is, people often, when parents, I don't think parents who use spanking are bad parents. I think that they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. People are telling them to do it. Maybe that was what was done to them. So they're not bad parents at all. They actually could be great parents and think they're doing the right thing. So for me, the reason why it has to be zero tolerance is because if your child's doing something and it gets you to the point where you're so upset that you're actually, maybe you've told them to stop, maybe you've told them to have a timeout, and maybe you've tried all these things and they're still doing it, and you get so frustrated, you go to hit your child. Well, that's when the hit might elevate into something more, or you use spanking as a mechanism, and maybe it was just a little tap that used to work, and now that doesn't work anymore, so you have to start hitting the kid harder. So then it's this moving from what would be permissible by law in Canada to abuse. Yeah.
I have been on these online forums for parents sometimes, and I get the feeling for a lot of the parents that do spank their kids for whatever reason and whatever form, they feel that it's part of building character.
Yeah.
They feel that a lot of the brats, the kids that have bad character are
That's right.
bad because they have never been spanked.
Yeah.
So if you can prove that
Yeah.
kids
Yeah.
that do not get spanking
Yeah.
actually have good character.
Yeah, and that's part of our so when I get a lot of backlash in the media and that sort of thing, I try not to listen to a lot of it, but at the same time I listen to it so that I can take the temperature of the argument, and that's what leads me to say, okay, well they say this, it's okay as long as you hug your kid. Okay, well let's use data and see what the data say. And so part of it is that, and so we do try to pick up those why do kids spank, and I have a whole other hour talk on why do parents spank their children, and why, and then I go through all the reasons why, and then I counter argue why those things don't make sense. But that's what we do. That we try to take those arguments and use data to show. The problem is. It's that it doesn't end there. You can have all the science in the world with beautifully designed studies, and it doesn't end there. Yeah.
I was just going to say that further to Tara's point, that it might be worth doing a study on the association of no violence.
Yeah.
And then what happens, the outcomes, right?
Yes.
So then that's the data you can show to the public.
Yeah.
That actually, if you don't spank a kid, it does not mean they're going to be brats.
That's right.
Disrespectful
Yeah.
and thoughtful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, and building on that, what about, and I don't know if this has been done, but a cross-country comparison, say with somewhere like Sweden, where
Yes.
they have much lower tolerance
Yeah.
for violence against children.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about your PAR study.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's lower mental illness in a society?
So there's been a lot of data out of Sweden because it was the first country in 1979 that banned all physical punishment against children. So they've had decades of time to say, okay, well, what's happening? So from Sweden, and there have been some. There's actually a book that does look at some comparing some countries, and what you will see is that there's fewer children that die from being abused. There's still the very small number, but it's like maybe 1 or 2 over a huge period of time. And they do look at a lot of the outcomes. Yeah. The problem is looking at being able to get data from different countries that are comparable. So unless you sort of go into the study initially, it's kind of hard. All right, I got to talk really quickly. So, we also want to look at resilience, and so we know that not every child who experiences abuse, fortunately, has bad outcomes, and so we're really interested in looking at what is it in that person's life that actually, what can we attribute to making them turn out have better results after being maltreated. So we find things like stable family environment, supportive relationships, and personality traits. This is from a review of the literature that was published in 2011. And we've just recently started this is a study that's under review right now. And so using Canadian data, we found things like higher education income, physical activity, good coping skills at the individual level were related to better mental health outcomes. And also supportive relationships, so many different types of support, so fostering attachment, guidance, etc. And I won't actually talk about this in the interest of time, but this was the most recent paper we published in JAMA Psychiatry just last month, and it actually compared child abuse and suicide-related outcomes in the general Canadian population and in military personnel. So I won't go into it other than to say, as you see, this is the 33% prevalence of child maltreatment that I mentioned in the Canadian general population, and we see almost 50% in the Canadian Armed Forces. And these are the relationships to suicide, but I can talk about all this after if you are interested. But it was some interesting findings. The interesting part, when we looked at the Canadian military, we compared deployment-related trauma to child abuse. Child abuse was the more robust and significant predictor in suicide outcomes compared to when we went face-to-face to deployment-related trauma. And so that was the big news story in that paper. So that's where I've been over the last 10 years, and where we're going is basically the Foundation's grant that was just recently funded. So we have our named program experts, Harriet McMillan, Michael Boyle, Lawrence Cates, and Jatinder Sareen. So this was funded for the next 5 years. And the main vision of the grant, or the whole grant, was focused around this sentence, was preventing child maltreatment will change a child's trajectory, improve health, and strengthen families. So we really want to move into, okay, we know it's bad, how do we prevent it from happening? And the gaps, so that was the vision, and the grant was really written around what are the gaps of the current knowledge. So we actually know very little about child maltreatment in Canada relative to other countries, so we need to be looking at more the Canadian context. And also, we know that child abuse is related to bad outcomes, but there's a real gap in taking that knowledge and actually preventing child abuse from occurring. So that's what we really want to do, is to really find ways so we can actually, measure that we've reduced either the prevalence of child maltreatment, or that we've reduced the negative impacts. So sort of thinking about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So this is our team. We have many people, including Terry Clausen from the University of Manitoba, Leanne Boyd from Healthy Child, national and international team members. And the program objectives are these 4 objectives. So first, we want to understand the size and scope of child maltreatment in the Canadian context. So in our Canadian context is Manitoba, and how that relates to both health and health services. Identify protective factors that are associated with the decreased likelihood that the child maltreatment will occur, and also improving health after child maltreatment. Using this information to develop new evidence-based intervention strategies, or to modify current ones that exist, and then to make sure that we're evaluating that and actually measuring whether or not we see a difference in that. So the main pieces, we're doing a quantitative epidemiological study of Manitobans. There'll be adolescents aged 14 to 17 years old and a parent in separate interviews. And as you all probably know, it's really difficult to do data analysis with child maltreatment, so we're well aware of all those challenges. Then we're going to link this data to the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. So that's sort of what I think makes this really unique, is that it's not just an epi-survey, but it's an epi-survey that's linked to all of the wealth of information that's at Manitoba Centre. We're also going to continue to do secondary data analyses on current data that exists, so looking at things like nationally representative samples and also more vulnerable samples that we might not be able to pick up in our Manitoba data set. So we'll be looking at StatsCan data. We'll be focusing on things like the Canadian Armed Forces. We've been doing a lot of work with the military, and also reported cases of child abuse in Canada. And then we will be using the EPI and the admin data together to try and figure out how we can create new programs and implement those programs to show that they've changed, and then measure those to see that they do change. So that will be, this is kind of schematic that's probably really hard to read, but this is sort of our thinking where we have many different types of child maltreatment, mental, physical, and health service use, and then all these different kinds of protective factors, both the individual, parent, and child. We have family level factors, community level factors, so we're not just looking at individuals, but we're trying to get a picture of the child and the world that the child belongs to. We are going to be forward-thinking and look at understudied areas, so things like physical punishment. There's still lots of work to be done there. Sibling violence is very understudied. Most people just accept that as sibling rivalry, but sometimes maybe it's more than that. And things like social media bullying, of course, is really important. And then we want to, if we're successful, not yet, but we will be successful. So we will be hoping to, at some point way down the line, expand beyond Manitoba and then also do more waves of data collection as well. So this will be not just 5 years, but this is 5 years and well beyond that. Okay, so that's our research, that the past and the present and the future. And then I was asked to also talk about creating a successful research group. So this is our research group. Dr. Jatinder Sareen is a psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry. He's the leader of our group, and this is many of the people that are in our research group. So we have Dr. Jatinder Sareen. So our group is the Manitoba Population Mental Health Research Group. So we have the leader, who's Dr. Sareen, and all of our faculty members, and in the brackets are all of our areas of expertise. So you'll notice there's a lot of overlap, but not a lot of real duplication. So there's people that have everyone has their own area of expertise. So these are the people that are currently in our group. We have research associates, many graduate students, and also collaborators. So how our group functions is that each faculty member, we each have our own independent program of research. So everyone goes out and gets their own funding, and we have our own area of expertise, but we work together. So we have all those people. Not everyone's on every project, but rather we work together based on expertise, time, and interest on projects. So certain people will be invited to certain projects. But even if we're not involved in each other's projects, we're always available to everyone else, and we don't expect anything in return. So there's sometimes people will say, you know what, I need your input in this, and I need feedback, but it's not, will you be an author on this paper now? But so we're always open and available to provide that for everyone's projects. And we also invite collaborators from outside of our lab, so people at the university and also beyond, on every research project as well. So we just find that having that expertise really makes every paper better. So what I did was I surveyed everyone in our lab to say, why do you think our group is successful? And so this all comes from people emailing me back and saying, well, it's this, 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 and this. So these are things that come. And this is one thing that was mentioned. I think it's really true. I think we're successful as a group because we make sure everyone is supported to be successful as individuals. And that's really important. So we facilitate, we foster, and we're nurturing an individual team growth, and we really do support each other. So we're independent, but we're very well supported. Oops. So in terms of building your team, our advice that comes from our lab is that work with people you like. So sometimes you don't know if you like someone until you worked with them for a little bit, but it's really important to make sure that you work well together and that you like each other. And we mentor each other, so there's a lot of mentorship in our group. So sometimes it's the senior people mentoring the less senior people, and that's sort of how mentorship works. But sometimes it doesn't work that way as well. So and those relationships change over time. But we always make sure that I have a mentor, but I also am mentoring other people. And so we also make sure we assign that to our students. So our students are always mentoring, the senior students are always mentoring the junior students, and that makes it really successful. We have diverse expertise, so if there were people in our group that had the exact same expertise as me, that probably would create problems. So there's overlap, and that's okay, but I feel like you need to have a research group where I'm the child maltreatment expert, and I'm the suicide expert, and I'm the homelessness expert, and different types of expertise, so that you're not everyone sort of has their own role within the group. And it's important if there is a lot of overlap to sort of define your roles within the group. We let everyone collaborate, and we make sure we're all working together towards a common goal. So the students play a really big role in our lab. They contribute. We're seen as equals in our lab, and they contribute a lot of really good ideas, and often those ideas lead to new papers. We have weekly lab meetings where we update our projects and share knowledge, so we see each other every week. We talk about challenges as they happen, and we problem solve together. So we really want to learn from each other's experiences. In terms of yourself being a good team player, it's important that when you say you're going to do your work, you do it on time. We're nice to each other and we help each other, and we do it when there's no benefit to us. So if someone's asking me to put in 2 hours of time on a project I'm not on, I'll do that, and I don't expect that now I'm going to be an author on the paper. So even though he doesn't contribute to something, we make sure that we do that, we support each other, and that way when I need help from someone, I feel like I can ask them as well. So we communicate and create a supportive environment. We're happy and celebrate each other's success, and we're not competitive with each other. And I think we're kind of just lucky, because we can't really teach that to people. But I think that's actually why we work really well together. Some of us have been working together for 13 years, and I really think we really are excited for each other, and we don't feel competitive with each other. We listen to each other. We admit to our own mistakes and kindly accept the mistakes of others. So I think that's really important. We have lots of safety nets in place so that we don't make mistakes, but the fact of the matter is we're all human and we do make them. So it's important to just sort of say, oops, I made a mistake. And if you can do that and not be upset when others make mistakes, then they'll admit to them instead of hoping you don't notice or blaming it on someone else, and we can quickly deal with it and move on. So we sort of creating that environment where it's all okay. And we offer our skills, but we also recognize our own limitations. So there's lots of times when I need expertise on a project that I don't have, and I don't feel embarrassed or worried what that's going to look like. If I need help, I go and I ask for that help. In terms of our students, we hire the great students, so we don't hire the good ones or the mediocre ones. We let them work in another lab. But we do really you have to hire great students. And what does that mean? Well, it means that they have to be a good fit with you. So a great student in my lab might not be a good student in your lab, and vice versa. So they have to be interested in the research and be engaged. We really encourage and praise our students. It really does help them feel part of the group if they know that they're appreciated. So we let them know they're valued team members. We provide them with opportunities to contribute and to lead. So often we'll be looking at the data and say, what do you think? And get them to, instead of just us, the faculty members, figuring it out and letting them just sort of be passive in the process. And we give them opportunities where they're first authors on papers and where they're coming up with their own ideas and leading those papers to the end. We invest in their teaching skills. So we invest in the students by teaching them new skills. So often I do one-on-one teaching in terms of stats and methods with students. So things that they might not have learned in classes, and to try and really develop their research skills. And then sometimes it's not me, sometimes it's the senior students teaching the junior students the skills. So we're really increasing their ability to do research. We send our students to conferences. We often go with them to conferences and introduce them and help them with the whole networking process, give them the exposure to to doing those presentations in a larger audience. And we shape them into independent researchers. So these last two things, instead of just, I have a lot of RAs who help me with my child maltreatment work, but I don't want to just have them working on my stuff. So what I do is make sure that they all have their own area of expertise. So one of my RAs is focused on emotional maltreatment, and that's her niche, which is, you know, under my umbrella, but it's really her own special thing. So we develop expertise and niches within our group that make sense, but we're not just duplicating our own work, but we're actually helping them to create their own area of expertise within that. And I think that's it.